Who would have guessed that two dentists could create America's most beloved confection? How did men dedicated to fighting tooth decay end up spinning sugar into edible clouds? And why did their sweet invention debut at a World's Fair, emerging from a machine that looked more like a medieval contraption than a candy maker? Turns out, the most delightfully contradictory stories often hold the deepest truths. These sugar-spinning dentists weren't trying to undermine their own profession. They stumbled into candy-making history quite by accident. This tale of unexpected invention will show you how a pair of Nashville physicians accidentally created something magical, while the rest of America was still marveling at electric lights. As we explore their story of sugar and serendipity, you might find your thoughts becoming as light and airy as the treat itself, settling you into the kind of gentle rest that feels as soft as spun sugar clouds. Sometimes the most unexpected combinations create something wonderful, like sharing a story with someone who's ready to settle in for the night. Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are, or what your favorite fair memory might be. There's something magical about connecting across time zones through these quiet moments. Now, find that perfect position where your shoulders can fully relax. Maybe adjust your pillow just so, and let the gentle hum of this story carry you into tonight's sweet journey. You're standing at the threshold of 1897, and Nashville, Tennessee is buzzing with anticipation. The Tennessee Centennial Exposition is about to open its gates, promising visitors wonders they've never imagined. Electric lights will illuminate the night, exotic foods will tempt adventurous palates, and somewhere in the midst of all this carefully planned spectacle, two men are about to accidentally change the course of American confectionery forever. Dr. William Morrison and Dr. John C. Wharton weren't your typical inventors. They were respectable dentists, pillars of their community, men who spent their days peering into mouths and lecturing about the evils of sugar. But they shared something beyond their professional training, a fascination with machinery, and an inventor's restless curiosity that wouldn't let them rest. In Morrison's workshop, behind his dental practice, the two men had been tinkering with an idea that seemed almost absurd. What if you could take ordinary granulated sugar and somehow transform it into something entirely different? Not just melted candy or hard confections, but something that defied the very nature of sugar itself? Their contraption looked like something a mad scientist might dream up. A large metal bowl sat atop a heating element, while a smaller perforated cylinder rotated in the center, driven by a hand crank that required considerable effort to turn. When sugar was poured into that spinning cylinder and heat was applied, something magical happened. The sugar would melt, and then, as centrifugal force took hold, it would fly outward through tiny holes, cooling instantly into impossibly fine threads that accumulated around the rim like gossamer. Honestly, I can picture these two distinguished gentlemen, probably still wearing their dental aprons, cranking away at this bizarre machine while sugar threads floated through the air like something from a fairy tale. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here they were, creating what was essentially pure sugar in its most tempting, most ethereal form. But here's where it gets fascinating. They didn't set out to revolutionize candy making. According to some accounts, they were actually trying to create a new type of medicinal preparation, something that might make sugar-based medicines more palatable for their patients. The cotton candy effect was, well, let's call it a happy accident. When the Tennessee Centennial Exposition opened its gates in May 1897, Morrison and Wharton were ready. They'd hauled their peculiar machine to the fairgrounds and set up shop, prepared to introduce the world to what they called fairy floss. The name itself tells you something about how people saw this creation. It wasn't just candy, it was something otherworldly, something that seemed to capture moonbeams and package them for human consumption. Picture the scene. Visitors approaching their booth for the first time, probably drawn by the sweet aroma and the curious sight of these two respectable-looking gentlemen operating what appeared to be some sort of scientific apparatus. The machine itself would have been mesmerizing to watch, sugar disappearing into the spinning chamber, then emerging as delicate strands that seemed to dance in the air, before being gathered onto wooden sticks. The price they charged was audacious, 25 cents for a serving of fairy floss. To put that in perspective, you could buy a full meal at most restaurants for less money. Most people could eat a substantial meal for less money than a single serving of fairy floss cost, making it a true luxury purchase that required real commitment from customers who wanted to experience this new wonder. Morrison and Wharton sold thousands upon thousands of servings of fairy floss during the exposition, generating profits that far exceeded their wildest expectations. And people were willing to pay, gladly, eagerly. They stood in lines, clutching their money, waiting for their turn to witness the transformation and taste something that had never existed before in human history. What made it so irresistible? Certainly, the novelty played a part. But there was something deeper happening here. This wasn't just about taste. Though the pure sweetness was undeniably appealing, it was about magic. In an age when most people still lived without electricity, when automobiles were rare curiosities, and flight was still a dream, here was something that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Some researchers wonder whether Morrison and Wharton truly understood the psychological impact of their creation, while others maintain they were simply opportunistic businessmen capitalizing on fairgoer curiosity. The truth, as with many entrepreneurial breakthroughs, likely falls somewhere between accidental genius and calculated showmanship. What we know for certain is this. By the time the Tennessee Centennial Exposition closed its gates in October 1897, the world had been introduced to a completely new form of confection. Two dentists from Nashville had accidentally created something that would become as American as apple pie, though infinitely more ethereal. They'd taken the most basic of ingredients, plain white sugar, and through ingenuity, accident, and perhaps a touch of magic, they'd spun it into dreams you could eat. And somewhere in that achievement, in that moment when the first visitor bit into their first taste of fairy floss, and felt it dissolve instantly on their tongue like sweet snow. The American love affair with cotton candy was born. It would spread from that single fairground booth to every corner of the country, evolving, adapting, and capturing hearts along the way. The success at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition should have made Morrison and Wharton rich and famous. But here's the thing about being ahead of your time. Sometimes the world isn't quite ready to catch up. As 1898 dawned, these two dentists found themselves in possession of a remarkable invention, a proven moneymaker, and absolutely no idea how to turn their 6-month windfall into a lasting business. You see, fairy floss existed in a strange limbo between novelty and necessity. It wasn't bread or milk, something people needed every day. It wasn't even like other candies, hard sweets or chocolates that could be wrapped, stored, and sold in general stores across the country. Fairy floss had to be made fresh, consumed immediately, and required a machine that most people had never seen, let alone knew how to operate. The name itself tells a fascinating story about how Americans were trying to understand this new creation. Fairy floss captured something ethereal, otherworldly, almost magical about the experience. It suggested something that belonged in storybooks rather than on dinner tables, which was both its charm and its challenge. Picture the early customers at county fairs in 1898 and 1899, approaching vendors with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They'd heard rumors, maybe seen newspaper accounts of the strange sugar clouds from Nashville, but witnessing the transformation firsthand was still shocking. Sugar going into a spinning machine, emerging as something that looked like nothing they'd ever seen before. The price point remained stubbornly high, and for good reason. The machines were expensive to build, difficult to transport, and required skilled operators who understood the delicate balance of heat, speed, and timing. Too little heat, and the sugar wouldn't melt properly. Too much, and it would caramelize into hard chunks. The spinning had to be just right. The collection technique required practice, and even experienced operators lost batches to humidity, wind, or simple mechanical failure. Morrison and Wharton sold thousands upon thousands of servings of fairy floss during the exposition, generating profits that far exceeded their wildest expectations. Most people could eat a substantial meal for less money than a single serving of fairy floss cost, making it a true luxury purchase that required real commitment from customers who wanted to experience this new wonder. And people were willing to pay, gladly, eagerly. They stood in lines, clutching their money, waiting for their turn to witness the transformation and taste something that had never existed before in human history. The success proved that Americans were hungry for more than just sustenance. They wanted experiences that transcended the practical and entered the realm of pure magic. What made it so irresistible? Certainly, the novelty played a part. But there was something deeper happening here. This wasn't just about taste. Though the pure sweetness was undeniably appealing, it was about witnessing alchemy. in an age when most people still lived without electricity, when automobiles were rare curiosities and flight was still a dream. Here was something that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Honestly, I'm amazed that Fairy Floss survived those early years at all. The whole enterprise seemed designed to fail. Here was a product that could only be made by hand, one serving at a time, using expensive equipment, in perfect weather conditions, by operators who'd mastered a technique that couldn't be learned from books. But something about those gossamer strands kept drawing people back. Maybe it was the theater of the process itself, watching ordinary sugar transform into something extraordinary. Maybe it was the novelty of eating air made sweet, or the way it dissolved on the tongue like flavored snow. Or maybe, and this is where it gets interesting, Americans were hungry for a new kind of pleasure. The turn of the century was a time of rapid change. Cities were growing, factories were humming, and people were beginning to have something previous generations rarely enjoyed: leisure time and disposable income. Fairy Floss represented something entirely new in the American experience: pleasure for pleasure's sake, sweetness without purpose beyond joy. Early vendors were a colorful bunch, often working multiple fairs throughout the traveling season, hauling their heavy machines from town to town in wagons or early motor vehicles. They were part mechanic, part performer, part salesman, because selling Fairy Floss wasn't just about the product, it was about selling the experience. Some enterprising operators began experimenting with flavors, adding drops of vanilla extract or lemon oil to the sugar before spinning. Others played with colors, though the delicate strands were notoriously difficult to tint without affecting the texture. Food historians continue to puzzle over whether these early flavor experiments were driven by customer demand or vendor creativity, with some arguing that customers specifically requested variety, while others suggest it was purely entrepreneurial innovation on the part of ambitious operators. The pink cotton candy that we associate with fairs today, that wouldn't become standard for decades. The seasonal nature of the business created its own challenges. Most fairs ran from late spring through early fall, leaving operators to find other work during winter months. Some tried setting up in storefront windows during holidays, but Fairy Floss never quite translated to indoor retail. It belonged outdoors, under canvas tents, surrounded by the sounds and smells of carnival life. The equipment itself evolved slowly during these early years. Manufacturers began producing slightly more reliable machines, though they remained finicky and expensive. The basic principle never changed: centrifugal force spinning melted sugar through tiny holes, but improvements in heating elements and collection methods made the process marginally more predictable. By 1900, Fairy Floss had established itself as a fixture at major fairs and expositions across the country, but it remained stubbornly artisanal. Unlike other successful American products of the era, it resisted mass production, standardization, and the kind of technological improvements that might have made it cheaper and more widely available. This resistance to industrialization, wasn't necessarily by design. The nature of spun sugar simply didn't lend itself to the factory methods that were transforming other food industries. You couldn't can it, package it for shipping, or produce it in advance. Every serving had to be made by hand, in real time, by someone who understood the almost alchemical process of turning granulated crystals into edible clouds. Yet somehow, in its stubborn insistence on remaining handmade, on requiring skilled operators and perfect conditions, Fairy Floss was developing something that would prove invaluable in the decades to come. It was becoming associated with special occasions, with childhood wonder, with moments of pure, uncomplicated joy. The vendors who succeeded in those early years understood something important. They weren't competing with other candy makers. They were creating their own category entirely. Fairy Floss wasn't trying to replace anything. It was offering something that had never existed before, an edible embodiment of magic itself. And as the new century gathered momentum, as America began to embrace leisure and entertainment as legitimate pursuits, this strange confection spun by hand at county fairs was quietly weaving itself into the fabric of American culture, one delicate strand at a time. By 1904, something remarkable was happening to the spinning sugar machine. While Morrison and Wharton had proven that Fairy Floss could capture hearts and wallets, their original contraption was still basically a sophisticated torture device that required the strength of a blacksmith and the patience of a saint. You had to crank that handle for what felt like hours, your arm aching, sweat dripping, all while trying to maintain the perfect speed and temperature that would transform sugar into edible silk. The problem wasn't just physical exhaustion, though that was certainly real. The bigger issue was reliability, or rather, the complete lack of it. On humid days, the sugar would clump. On windy days, the delicate strands would blow away before they could be collected. If the temperature was even slightly off, you'd end up with caramelized chunks instead of gossamer threads. Operating one of these early machines was like trying to conduct an orchestra while blindfolded in a thunderstorm. Throughout the early 1900s, a parade of inventors and tinkerers began filing patents for improved cotton candy machines. Some focused on better heating elements, others on more efficient collection systems, still others on making the whole contraption lighter and more portable. The original Morris and Wharton design had proven the concept, but clearly there was room for improvement. Most of these early improvements were incremental, small adjustments to heating coils, slight modifications to the spinning mechanism, attempts to make the collection process more efficient. But each innovation built upon the previous ones, gradually making the machines more reliable, more portable, and easier to operate. The real breakthrough came from manufacturers who approached the problem systematically, treating cotton candy production as an engineering challenge rather than an art form. Working throughout the 1910s, these innovators developed not just better machines, but better techniques, better ingredients, and better training methods for operators. Honestly, I'm starting to think there was something almost obsessive about the pursuit of the perfect cotton candy machine. Engineers and inventors seemed drawn to the challenge of taming this temperamental process, of finding ways to make magic more predictable without destroying its essential wonder. The improved machines included more precise temperature gauges, better insulation to maintain consistent heat, and most importantly, redesigned collection systems that gathered the sugar threads more efficiently. What had previously required an experienced operator working under perfect conditions could now be accomplished by anyone willing to follow detailed instructions and practice the basic techniques. But the innovations went beyond just mechanical improvements. Inventors also developed better methods for flavoring and coloring the sugar, techniques that actually worked without compromising the delicate spinning process. Suddenly, vendors could offer vanilla fairy floss, strawberry, even exotic flavors that had previously been impossible to achieve. Machine manufacturers remain divided on whether systematic improvements helped or hindered the romantic appeal of cotton candy, with some arguing that standardization stripped away the magical unpredictability that made early fairy floss so enchanting, while others maintain that reliability was essential for the product's long-term survival and widespread adoption. The improvements also enabled new possibilities that had been impractical with the original equipment. Operators could now experiment with different presentation styles and serving methods. The early attempts to create elaborate shapes or artistic arrangements had usually resulted in sticky disasters, but the new machines could handle these creative applications without compromising the basic product quality. Picture a county fair in the early 1920s. Instead of the simple white clouds that had defined fairy floss for its first quarter century, vendor booths now displayed pink, blue, yellow, and green confections that looked like edible rainbows. The visual appeal was almost as important as the taste, transforming cotton candy from a curious novelty into something that actively competed for attention with other colorful fair attractions. The mechanical improvements also meant that cotton candy could finally expand beyond its traditional carnival habitat. The new machines were reliable enough for indoor venues, quiet enough for locations with noise restrictions, and efficient enough to make small-scale operations profitable. This expansion introduced the product to audiences who had very different expectations than traditional fairgoers. The influx of improved machines also attracted a new generation of operators. People who had been intimidated by the original equipment's complexity and unreliability suddenly saw cotton candy as a viable business opportunity. This created more competition, but also expanded the overall market, introducing the product to regions and demographics that had never encountered it before. Some of the most successful operators became known for their theatrical presentation. They understood that customers weren't just buying candy, they were buying an experience. The best vendors could work their improved machines like performance artists, spinning sugar while entertaining crowds with patter, jokes, and showmanship that made the entire process feel magical. The technology had evolved to the point where the mechanical challenges were largely solved, but the real art was still in the presentation. A skilled operator could make even the most efficient machine seem mysterious and wonderful, maintaining the sense of magic that had always been cotton candy's greatest selling point. Regional preferences began to emerge during this period. Different areas developed distinct approaches to flavoring, coloring, and presenting cotton candy. What worked well in the agricultural Midwest might not appeal to urban East Coast customers, and successful operators learned to adapt their techniques to local tastes and expectations. Training methods became more systematic as well, where learning to operate the original machines had required weeks or months of apprenticeship. Mastering the improved equipment could be accomplished much more quickly. This democratization of the skill opened the field to people who might never have considered cotton candy as a business opportunity. By the mid-1920s, the spinning sugar machine had transformed from Morrison and Wharton's original contraption into something that was genuinely practical for widespread commercial use. What had started as an expensive novelty requiring expert operation had become accessible technology that could be mastered by anyone with basic mechanical aptitude, a willingness to learn, and perhaps most importantly, an understanding that they weren't just making candy, they were creating edible dreams. The transformation was so complete that many people encountering cotton candy for the first time had no idea how difficult and unreliable the early machines had been. To them, watching sugar transform into edible clouds seemed effortless, almost automatic. The technology had become invisible, which is often the mark of truly successful innovation, and with that invisibility came something even more important: the foundation for cotton candy to become not just a novelty, but an American tradition. With better machines spreading across the country, cotton candy was about to meet its true calling, the traveling carnival circuit. You see, while fairs and expositions had given fairy Floss its debut, it was the nomadic world of traveling shows that would transform it from an occasional novelty into an essential American experience. Picture the carnival operators of the 1910s and 1920s, a breed apart from ordinary business people. These were folks who lived on wheels, following weather patterns, crop cycles, and the mysterious rhythms of small-town America. They carried everything they owned in wagons or early motor trucks, and every square inch of space had to earn its keep. Adding a cotton candy machine to their arsenal wasn't just about selling more treats. It was about finding something that could justify the weight, the maintenance, and the precious real estate it would occupy. The improved machines made that calculation finally worthwhile. But the real magic happened when cotton candy met the carnival aesthetic. Suddenly, those colorful sugar clouds weren't just candy. They were part of the spectacle, another element in the carefully orchestrated assault on the senses that made carnival life so intoxicating. The most successful cotton candy vendors of this era were colorful characters, often adopting theatrical names and personas that helped them stand out in a crowd. They worked the Midwest Circuit, the Southern Route, the Eastern Seaboard, hauling their machines from town to town in converted trucks painted in bright colors with elaborate lettering that promised sweet dreams spun before your eyes, or magic sugar clouds. Honestly, I can't imagine what it must have been like hauling that heavy equipment across unpaved roads, bouncing through potholes, praying that nothing would shake loose before you reached the next town. The dedication it took to make that life work, day after day, season after season, that's something special. These traveling vendors understood something that many stationary operators missed. Cotton candy wasn't just about the product, it was about the performance. They'd set up their machines in the most visible spots possible, usually right at the carnival entrance where the sweet aroma would hit visitors the moment they arrived. Then they'd work those machines like maestros conducting symphonies, spinning sugar while calling out to potential customers in voices that could cut through the din of calliope music and carnival barkers. What made the best operators special wasn't just their showmanship, it was their understanding of carnival psychology. They knew that people came to carnivals to escape, to experience something impossible, to feel like children again, even if only for a few hours. Cotton candy fit perfectly into that fantasy. Here was food that looked like clouds, that dissolved like magic, that connected adults to their most innocent memories of wonder and sweetness. The traveling operators developed their own culture around cotton candy, sharing techniques at winter gatherings, trading stories about difficult customers and mechanical disasters, and constantly innovating to stay ahead of the competition. Some became known for their flavoring experiments, others for their theatrical presentations, still others for their ability to work the most temperamental machines under the worst possible conditions. There's still debate among carnival historians about whether the early cotton candy vendors were primarily entrepreneurs or entertainers, with some suggesting they were shrewd business people who understood the psychology of impulse buying, while others argue they were genuine performers who happened to make money selling sugar. The truth, as usual with carnival folk, probably encompasses both perspectives. One of the most fascinating aspects of carnival cotton candy culture was how it adapted to local tastes and traditions. In the South, vendors might experiment with flavors that echoed regional preferences. In areas with diverse populations, they developed variations that appealed to different cultural backgrounds. The flexibility of the improved machines allowed for this kind of regional customization, something that had been impossible with the rigid early equipment. The carnival circuit also created the first real cotton candy dynasties, families who passed down not just machines and techniques, but entire routes, relationships with local promoters, and the hard-won knowledge of which towns were worth visiting and which should be avoided. These multi-generational operations developed distinctive styles and reputations that could make or break a season's profits. These traveling vendors faced challenges that stationary operators never had to consider. Weather could destroy a day's worth of inventory in minutes. Mechanical breakdowns meant lost income with no nearby repair shops. And the constant travel took a toll on both equipment and operators that required a special kind of resilience and resourcefulness. But they also enjoyed freedoms that traditional business people envied. When a town proved disappointing, they could literally pack up and move on to greener pastures. When a new technique proved successful, they could test it across dozens of different markets. And when the mood struck them, they could simply disappear into the vast American landscape, following their own mysterious compass toward whatever adventure lay over the next hill. The carnival operators were also inadvertent anthropologists, documenting American tastes and preferences as they moved from region to region. Their success or failure in different markets provided real-time feedback about what people wanted, how much they were willing to pay, and how cotton candy fit into the broader landscape of American leisure and consumption. The seasonal nature of carnival work created its own rhythms and traditions. Most shows ran from late spring through early fall, with winter months devoted to equipment maintenance, route planning, and the kind of social gatherings where techniques were shared and business relationships renewed. These off-season connections proved crucial for maintaining the informal networks that kept the carnival world functioning. By the late 1920s, these traveling sugar merchants had established cotton candy as more than just a regional curiosity or occasional fair treat. They'd woven it into the fabric of American carnival culture, made it an expected part of the traveling show experience, and created a network of skilled operators who could bring the magic of spun sugar to virtually any community in the country. The carnival circuit had given cotton candy something invaluable: mobility. No longer confined to major fairs or urban venues, it could now reach small towns, rural communities, and places that might see a traveling show only once or twice a year. The cotton candy vendors became ambassadors of sweetness, carrying their sugary magic into corners of America that had never experienced anything quite like it. And in that process, they were doing something even more important than selling candy. They were creating memories. For countless American children, their first taste of cotton candy would come from one of these traveling vendors, experienced against the backdrop of carnival lights, calliope music, and the intoxicating atmosphere of temporary magic that had rolled into town on wheels. Those memories would prove to be cotton candy's greatest asset, more valuable than any machine improvement or marketing campaign. Because once you've experienced the wonder of watching sugar transform into edible clouds, once you felt that distinctive texture dissolve on your tongue while surrounded by the sights and sounds of carnival magic, you're marked for life as someone who understands that sometimes the most impossible things are also the most wonderful. By the early decades of the 20th century, something was bothering the cotton candy industry, and it wasn't just the occasional mechanical breakdown or rainy day that ruined a batch of spun sugar. It was the name itself. Fairy Floss had served the product well since its debut, but America was changing, and so were American tastes, and what had once sounded magical and otherworldly was beginning to feel, well, a little too fanciful for a country that was embracing a more modern sensibility. The problem wasn't just linguistic, it was psychological. Fairy Floss suggested something delicate, European, perhaps even a bit precious for the increasingly confident and assertive American market. Vendors were noticing subtle resistance from certain customers, particularly men, who sometimes hesitated before ordering something with such a whimsical name. The name was creating a barrier to sales that had nothing to do with the product itself. Marketing professionals of the era, those early pioneers of American advertising, began to recognize that perception could be more powerful than reality, and that sometimes a simple name change could transform a product's entire market position. They looked at this confection that had captured American hearts, but was potentially held back by its ethereal moniker, and they saw opportunity. The solution came from an obvious but brilliant observation: the visual similarity between spun sugar and cotton. Someone, and historical records don't clearly identify who deserves credit, notice that the white, fluffy texture of traditional fairy floss looked remarkably like cotton balls. It was such a natural connection that it's surprising it took years for anyone to make it commercially. Cotton candy. The name had everything the old moniker lacked. It was distinctly American, cotton being such a fundamental part of the nation's agricultural and economic identity. It was practical and descriptive rather than fanciful. It suggested something substantial and familiar rather than ethereal and foreign. And perhaps most importantly, it was completely gender neutral, something that both men and women could order without any self-consciousness. The transition wasn't immediate or uniform. Different regions adopted the new terminology at different speeds, and some vendors stubbornly clung to fairy floss well into the middle of the century. Regional preferences, local traditions, and simple resistance to change meant that both names coexisted for decades in different parts of the country. Trade associations and industry publications began using cotton candy more frequently in their materials. Equipment manufacturers started advertising cotton candy machines rather than fairy floss apparatus, and gradually, the old name began to fade from common usage, though it never disappeared entirely. Marketing historians continue to analyze whether this rebrand represented calculated business strategy or organic cultural evolution, with some emphasizing deliberate industry coordination, while others argue that the name change emerged naturally from shifting consumer preferences and regional linguistic patterns. The name change coincided with other innovations that helped modernize the product's image. Vendors began experimenting with new colors beyond the traditional white and pale pink, creating bright blues, vivid greens, and eye-catching yellows that looked more like carnival excitement than fairy tale delicacy. The visual impact was dramatic. Cotton candy displays became more vibrant, more attention-grabbing, more aligned with the bold aesthetic of modern American entertainment. Packaging and presentation also evolved during this period. While cotton candy still had to be consumed fresh, vendors developed better ways to display and serve it, using colorful paper cones instead of plain wooden sticks, creating more appealing presentations that emphasized the product's visual drama. The marketing became part of the experience, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't just candy, it was entertainment. The advertising language changed too. Gone were the ethereal, mystical descriptions that had characterized much early fairy floss marketing. Cotton candy advertisements emphasized fun, excitement, and all-American enjoyment. The product was repositioned from something magical and otherworldly to something wholesome and patriotic, a sweet treat that embodied American innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. Honestly, you have to admire the wisdom of embracing a name that connected the product so directly to American identity. Cotton wasn't just a crop. It was a symbol of American agriculture, industry, and regional pride, especially in the South where cotton candy found some of its most enthusiastic early markets. The rebrand also opened up new marketing opportunities. Cotton candy could now be promoted as distinctly American, something to be proud of rather than something to explain. International visitors to American fairs and carnivals could experience authentic American cotton candy, positioning it as a cultural export rather than a curiosity with unclear origins. The regional adoption patterns were fascinating. Areas with strong agricultural connections, particularly cotton-growing regions, tended to embrace the new name more quickly, perhaps because it resonated with local economic and cultural identity. Urban areas with more diverse populations and stronger connections to international culture sometimes retained fairy floss longer. Marketing materials began emphasizing cotton candy's American origins and technological innovation. Advertisements highlighted the mechanical ingenuity required to transform simple sugar into something so remarkable, positioning the product as an example of American creativity and engineering prowess rather than mere confectionery novelty. By the mid-20th century, cotton candy had become the dominant terminology across most of the country, though regional variations and occasional throwback references to fairy floss persisted in certain markets and among vendors who valued tradition over marketing efficiency. The success of the rebrand demonstrated something important about American consumer psychology. Names matter deeply. Perception shapes reality in powerful ways. And sometimes the difference between a regional curiosity and a national phenomenon is nothing more than finding the right words to describe something people already love. The transformation from fairy floss to cotton candy wasn't just a marketing success, it was a cultural achievement. The new name helped solidify the product's position as an essential element of American leisure culture, something that belonged at baseball games and state fairs, something that was woven into the fabric of American childhood and nostalgia. And perhaps most importantly, the rebrand removed psychological barriers that might have limited cotton candy's complete integration into American life. No longer exotic or precious, no longer whimsical in ways that might seem childish. It was now simply, authentically, unmistakably American, ready to take its place alongside hot dogs, apple pie, and all the other foods that would come to define the American experience. The legacy of this transformation would prove lasting, ensuring that cotton candy could grow and evolve with American culture rather than remaining trapped in the amber of its original, more limited identity. Then came 1929, and with it, the economic catastrophe that would test every American industry, including the seemingly recession-proof business of spinning sugar into dreams. The stock market crash hit the cotton candy world like a tornado through a carnival. Suddenly, luxuries that had seemed essential became impossible extravagances, and spending a quarter on spun sugar felt like throwing money into the wind. You might think that something as inexpensive as cotton candy would weather economic hardship easily, but you'd be underestimating how quickly people's priorities shift when every penny matters. A quarter could buy a loaf of bread, a can of soup, or contribute to rent money. Choosing to spend it on something that dissolved in your mouth within minutes required a kind of optimism that was in short supply during those dark years. The carnival circuit, cotton candy's primary distribution network, was among the first casualties of the Depression. Small towns that had eagerly anticipated traveling shows suddenly couldn't afford the luxury of entertainment. Disposable income vanished, and with it, the crowds that had sustained the cotton candy vendors through 3 decades of growth and prosperity. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The very crisis that threatened to destroy the cotton candy industry also forced it to evolve in ways that would ultimately make it stronger. Vendors who had relied on traditional carnival routes found themselves scrambling for new markets, new customers, and new ways to justify their product's existence in a world where frivolity felt almost immoral. The first innovation was practical, sugar rationing. As the Depression deepened and resources became scarce, cotton candy operators had to find ways to stretch their primary ingredient further than ever before. Some experimented with adding corn syrup to reduce pure sugar content. Others developed techniques for creating larger-looking portions with less actual material. And the most creative vendors found ways to incorporate less expensive sweeteners without completely compromising the texture and taste. These adaptations weren't just about survival. They were about maintaining dignity. Cotton candy vendors were proud people who had built their livelihoods around bringing joy to others, and they weren't about to let economic hardship force them to abandon their craft entirely. Instead, they adapted, innovated, and found ways to continue spinning sugar even when sugar itself became a luxury. Some operators pivoted to serving different markets entirely. Instead of targeting families with discretionary income, they focused on children who might have saved pennies for weeks to afford a single serving of cotton candy. The psychological impact was profound. For these kids, cotton candy wasn't just candy. It was proof that magic could still exist even in the darkest times. The industry also discovered the power of cotton candy as comfort food, not in the traditional sense, but as emotional comfort. During the worst years of the Depression, Watching sugar transform into something beautiful and ephemeral provided a kind of therapeutic escape that people desperately needed. The process itself, the spinning, the gradual accumulation of delicate strands, became almost meditative for both operators and customers. There's considerable debate among economic historians about whether the cotton candy industry's survival strategies during the Depression represented genuine innovation or simply desperate improvisation, with some arguing that necessity drove real improvements, while others suggest that most adaptations were temporary measures that disappeared once prosperity returned. Regional differences became more pronounced during this period. Areas hit hardest by unemployment saw cotton candy vendors disappear entirely, while regions with more stable economies, particularly those tied to agriculture or government employment, maintained modest markets for the product. The geographic distribution of cotton candy became a real-time map of American economic health. Honestly, I find it remarkable that any luxury food survived the Depression at all, but cotton candy had something that many other treats lacked. It was cheap to produce, required minimal infrastructure, and could be sold in tiny quantities to match whatever customers could afford. A vendor could literally adjust portion sizes based on what people had in their pockets. The war years that followed brought their own challenges. Sugar rationing became official government policy, and cotton candy vendors found themselves competing with essential food production for access to their primary ingredient. Some operators gave up entirely, storing their machines in barns and basements, waiting for better times. Others found ways to continue operating on a much smaller scale, treating cotton candy as a special occasion luxury rather than an everyday treat. But perhaps the most important development during these crisis years was the emergence of what we might call underground cotton candy networks. Vendors who maintained their skills and equipment even when they couldn't operate publicly, keeping the knowledge and traditions alive during the darkest periods. These hidden operators would prove crucial when prosperity finally returned, providing the experienced workforce needed to rebuild the industry. The rationing period also led to some fascinating substitution experiments. Vendors tried everything from molasses to honey to artificial sweeteners, searching for alternatives that could produce something resembling traditional cotton candy texture and flavor. Most of these experiments failed, but a few successful adaptations expanded the range of possible cotton candy variations in ways that would benefit the industry for decades to come. Community support networks developed around struggling cotton candy vendors. In some small towns, local businesses would pool resources to ensure that the traveling cotton candy operator could still visit during annual festivals or holidays. These communities understood instinctively that some traditions were worth preserving even during hardship, that cotton candy represented something valuable beyond its monetary cost. The psychological impact of maintaining cotton candy production during crisis years can't be overstated. For many Americans, the continued availability of this whimsical treat served as evidence that the country hadn't completely lost its capacity for joy, that underneath all the economic hardship and uncertainty, there was still room for wonder and sweetness. By the time World War II ended and sugar rationing was lifted, the cotton candy industry had been fundamentally transformed. It was leaner, more efficient, more adaptable, and perhaps most importantly, more aware of its own cultural significance. The crisis years had forced everyone involved to think deeply about why cotton candy mattered and what they were willing to sacrifice to keep it alive. The vendors who survived the Depression and war years weren't just business operators. They were custodians of an American tradition, keepers of a small but essential piece of the national spirit. And they were about to discover that their dedication during the dark years had positioned them perfectly for the unprecedented prosperity and cultural explosion that was coming. The 1950s arrived like a sugar rush after years of deprivation, and with them came the innovation that would finally democratize cotton candy production: electricity. For more than half a century, making cotton candy had required the kind of physical stamina that limited the pool of potential operators. But electric motors changed everything, transforming what had been an athletic endeavor into something that virtually anyone could master. Picture the first electric cotton candy machine humming to life in 1949. No more hand cranking until your arm felt like it might fall off. No more maintaining perfect rhythm while sweat dripped into your eyes. No more losing batches because you couldn't sustain the ideal speed for long enough. Just flip a switch and watch as consistent, reliable centrifugal force did all the heavy lifting. The Gold Medal Products Company of Cincinnati deserves credit for perfecting the electric cotton candy machine that would become the industry standard. Though they built upon earlier experiments by several inventors who had been working toward the same goal throughout the 1940s. Their Whirlwind model, introduced in 1949, was everything the industry had been waiting for: reliable, efficient, and simple enough that a teenager could operate it safely. But the real revolution wasn't just mechanical, it was economic. Electric machines cost less to operate, required less skill to run, and produced more consistent results than their hand-cranked predecessors. Suddenly, cotton candy wasn't just the domain of experienced carnival veterans. It was accessible to anyone with a few $100s and basic electrical knowledge, from small-town entrepreneurs to big-city concession stand operators. The democratization happened quickly. By 1952, electric cotton candy machines were showing up at venues that had never been able to justify the expense and complexity of the old equipment. Movie theaters, skating rinks, school carnivals, church festivals, anywhere people gathered for entertainment, cotton candy could now be a practical addition to the experience. This expansion created its own challenges. The flood of new operators meant increased competition, but also diluted quality control. Some newcomers treated cotton candy like any other concession item, focusing on speed and profit margins rather than the theatrical presentation that had always been part of the product's appeal. Veterans worried that the magic was being lost in the rush toward mechanization and mass market accessibility. Honestly, there's something bittersweet about progress sometimes. The old hand-cranked machines required real artistry to operate, and watching a master vendor work one was like witnessing a performance. The electric machines were undeniably better in practical terms, but they removed some of the human drama that had made cotton candy special. Equipment manufacturers responded to the broader market by developing machines in different sizes and price ranges. Small tabletop models for occasional use, medium-sized units for regular concession operations, and large commercial machines capable of high-volume production. The variety meant that cotton candy could scale to match virtually any venue or budget. The post-war economic boom provided the perfect environment for this expansion. Americans had money to spend on entertainment and treats. Leisure time was increasing, and there was a general optimism about technology and progress that made electric cotton candy machines seem like symbols of modern convenience rather than threats to tradition. Regional preferences began to standardize during this period. The availability of reliable machines meant that cotton candy could be produced consistently anywhere in the country, reducing the local variations that had developed during the earlier, more artisanal era. Pink became the dominant color nationwide, though blue remained popular in certain markets and special occasions still called for traditional white. Trade shows and industry publications began covering cotton candy as a serious business opportunity rather than a curiosity. Articles appeared in concession trade magazines explaining profit margins, discussing optimal pricing strategies, and reviewing different machine models. The professionalization of the industry marked a significant shift from its carnival roots toward mainstream commercial acceptance. Some industry observers wonder whether the electric revolution helped or hindered cotton candy's cultural significance, with purists arguing that mechanization stripped away the mystique, while pragmatists contend that accessibility ensured the tradition's survival and growth. The training requirements changed dramatically. Where learning to operate a hand-cranked machine had taken weeks or months of practice, mastering an electric model could be accomplished in hours. This reduced barriers to entry, but also meant that the deep knowledge of sugar chemistry and technique that had characterized master operators was no longer essential for basic production. Quality became more predictable, but also more uniform. Electric machines produced cotton candy that looked and tasted essentially identical regardless of who operated them, which was good for business consistency, but reduced the personality and individual flair that had distinguished different vendors in the carnival era. New markets opened up that had been impossible to serve with hand-cranked equipment. Indoor venues with limited space, events with strict noise restrictions, situations where reliable operation was more important than theatrical presentation. Electric machines made cotton candy viable in contexts where the old equipment would have been impractical or impossible. The success of electric cotton candy machines also spurred innovation in related areas. Better packaging solutions, improved flavoring techniques, more efficient sugar handling systems, and enhanced safety features that made the machine suitable for operation by less experienced personnel. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was essentially complete. Cotton candy had successfully transitioned from a labor-intensive artisanal product to a mechanized treat that could be produced reliably and profitably almost anywhere. The electric revolution had removed the last significant barriers to widespread adoption, setting the stage for cotton candy to become a ubiquitous part of American entertainment culture. The hand-cranked era was over, but its legacy lived on in the theatrical presentation style that distinguished good cotton candy vendors from merely competent ones. The best operators understood that even with electric machines, they were still in the business of creating wonder, not just spinning sugar. And as the 1950s progressed, cotton candy was about to discover that its newfound accessibility would open doors to venues and opportunities that would cement its place as an essential element of the American experience. From baseball stadiums to amusement parks to the growing phenomenon of suburban shopping centers. The 1960s brought cotton candy face to face with the American dream made manifest, the great suburban expansion that would reshape not just where people lived, but how they entertained themselves. Suddenly, cotton candy wasn't confined to traveling carnivals or county fairs. It was about to become a permanent resident of the places where Americans gathered to have fun. From the gleaming new shopping malls to the concrete stadiums where baseball became a national obsession. Coney Island had always been cotton candy's spiritual home in the Northeast, but now similar entertainment destinations were sprouting up across the country, each one looking for attractions that would draw families and create the kind of magical atmosphere that kept people coming back. Cotton candy, with its visual drama and nostalgic appeal, was a natural fit for these new permanent amusement venues. The shopping mall phenomenon created an entirely new category of cotton candy consumption. Indoor venues where families spent entire afternoons browsing stores, eating at food courts, and looking for small treats that could make the experience feel special. Mall owners quickly discovered that the sweet aroma of spinning sugar could actually encourage shoppers to linger longer, transforming a practical errand into an enjoyable outing. But it was baseball that truly cemented cotton candy's place in mainstream American culture. Picture any major league stadium during the golden age of baseball. The crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd, and threading through it all, vendors calling out cotton candy here. Get your cotton candy. The pairing was so perfect it seemed inevitable. Both baseball and cotton candy represented something quintessentially American, nostalgic, and pleasantly predictable. The stadium vendors developed their own culture and techniques, learning to navigate crowded bleachers while balancing trays of delicate spun sugar, mastering the art of making sales during brief moments between plays, and understanding that for many fans, especially children, cotton candy was as essential to the baseball experience as peanuts and Cracker Jacks. These permanent venues required different approaches than the traveling carnival circuit. Consistency became more important than novelty. Customers expected cotton candy to taste the same every time they visited, whether that was weekly throughout baseball season or monthly during shopping trips. The standardization that had begun with electric machines accelerated as venues demanded reliable quality from their concession operators. Amusement parks represented perhaps the most natural evolution of cotton candy's role in American entertainment. Places like Disneyland, which opened in 1955, understood instinctively that cotton candy wasn't just food. It was an essential element of the fantasy experience they were trying to create. The sight of children walking through the park with pink clouds of spun sugar became iconic, a visual shorthand for childhood joy and wonder. The economics of permanent venue cotton candy were fundamentally different from the carnival model. Instead of maximizing profits during brief visits to each town, operators could build steady, long-term customer relationships. Regular customers meant predictable revenue, which justified investments in better equipment, more diverse flavoring options, and improved presentation techniques. Business historians continue to argue about whether cotton candy's mainstream success represented natural market evolution or conscious corporate strategy, with some emphasizing consumer demand driving venue adoption, while others point to deliberate marketing decisions by entertainment companies seeking signature treats that would enhance their brand identity. Some cultural critics began questioning whether cotton candy's integration into mainstream commercial venues diluted its special quality, arguing that something available at the local mall couldn't maintain the same magical associations as a rare treat encountered only at traveling carnivals. The debate reflected broader concerns about the commercialization of American leisure and the loss of authentic experiences. Honestly, I think those critics were missing something important. Cotton candy's success in permanent venues didn't diminish its magic, it democratized it. Children who might never attend a traveling carnival could still experience the wonder of watching sugar transform into edible clouds, and that accessibility was ultimately more valuable than exclusivity. The boardwalk culture that developed along America's coasts created another perfect environment for cotton candy. Seaside destinations like Atlantic City, Ocean City, and Santa Monica Pier became synonymous with cotton candy consumption, places where the salt air and carnival atmosphere made spun sugar feel like an essential part of the experience. Regional chains began emerging during this period. Operators who managed cotton candy concessions at multiple venues across a geographic area, bringing professional management techniques to what had traditionally been an informal, entrepreneurial business. These chains could negotiate better supplier agreements, implement consistent training programs, and maintain quality standards across multiple locations. The integration into permanent venues also drove innovation in cotton candy presentation and packaging. Operators experimented with different serving containers, various portion sizes, and creative flavor combinations that could differentiate their product from competitors. The steady customer base provided a testing ground for new ideas that wouldn't have been practical in the hit-or-miss environment of traveling shows. Sports venues beyond baseball also embraced cotton candy as part of their concession offerings. Football stadiums, basketball arenas, hockey rinks, anywhere crowds gathered for entertainment, cotton candy vendors found willing customers who associated the treat with fun, celebration, and special occasions. Franchise opportunities began appearing in trade publications, offering turnkey cotton candy operations for entrepreneurs who wanted to enter the business without developing their own techniques and supplier relationships. The franchising model brought corporate discipline to cotton candy while maintaining the personal touch that customers expected from concession operators. The expansion into permanent venues also meant cotton candy could finally escape the seasonal limitations that had constrained the industry since its carnival origins. Year-round operations at shopping centers, amusement parks, and sports venues provided steady income streams that allowed operators to invest in better equipment and more sophisticated business practices. By the late 1960s, cotton candy had completed its transformation from traveling novelty to permanent fixture of American entertainment culture. It was available wherever Americans gathered for fun, from the most sophisticated urban amusement parks to the smallest suburban shopping centers. The product had found its perfect ecological niche, thriving in the spaces where families sought simple pleasures and sweet memories. The carnival origins weren't forgotten, but they no longer defined cotton candy's identity. It had become something larger, more fundamental to American leisure culture, a bridge between childhood and adulthood that could transform an ordinary outing into something slightly magical, proving that some pleasures are too good to be confined to special occasions. And as the 1960s drew to a close, cotton candy was perfectly positioned for the even greater expansion that would come with the decades ahead, when shopping malls would become America's new town squares, when amusement parks would grow into massive entertainment complexes, and when cotton candy would claim its permanent place as an essential ingredient in the American recipe for fun. You've probably never stopped to think about the physics of what happens when you bite into cotton candy, but the science behind those dissolving strands is actually more fascinating than the machinery that creates them. What you're experiencing in that moment, as the sugar melts instantly on your tongue, is the result of an almost magical transformation that turns solid crystals into something that's essentially edible air. Here's what's really happening in that spinning machine. When granulated sugar is heated to approximately 320 degrees Fahrenheit, it reaches what chemists call the hard crack stage, where the sucrose molecules break down and reform into a liquid state. But here's where cotton candy gets interesting. Instead of cooling slowly like traditional hard candy, the melted sugar is immediately forced through tiny holes by centrifugal force, creating threads so thin they're barely visible to the naked eye. The physics involved is actually quite elegant. As the liquid sugar exits those microscopic openings, it cools almost instantaneously in the surrounding air, solidifying into threads that are incredibly fine, roughly comparable to spider silk in diameter. These threads are so delicate that they contain mostly air, which explains why cotton candy dissolves so quickly when it hits the moisture in your mouth. But the real magic happens in the crystalline structure. Traditional sugar crystals are dense, organized, and relatively stable. Cotton candy sugar, on the other hand, has been transformed into an amorphous, or non-crystalline, state that's fundamentally different from its original form. The rapid cooling doesn't give the sugar molecules time to reorganize into their normal crystal pattern, leaving them in a kind of suspended animation that makes them incredibly soluble. The temperature control required for this process is more precise than most people realize. Too cool, and the sugar won't melt properly, creating clumps instead of smooth threads. Too hot, and the sugar begins to caramelize, developing that distinctive brown color and burnt flavor that ruins the delicate sweetness cotton candy is known for. The ideal temperature window is surprisingly narrow. Just a few degrees in either direction can mean the difference between perfect spun sugar and expensive waste. Food scientists have long been intrigued by cotton candy's unique properties, particularly its ability to maintain structural integrity despite being mostly air. The secret lies in the way those microscopic threads interlock with each other, creating a web-like matrix that can support its own weight while remaining incredibly delicate to the touch. Some researchers argue that cotton candy represents one of the earliest examples of what we now call molecular gastronomy, while others maintain it's simply a mechanical process that happens to produce interesting textural effects. The debate reflects broader questions about the relationship between food science and culinary art, and whether understanding the process enhances or diminishes our appreciation of the result. The moisture sensitivity that makes cotton candy dissolve so quickly in your mouth also makes it incredibly challenging to store or transport. Humidity levels above a certain threshold can cause the delicate structure to collapse as the sugar threads absorb water from the air and begin to stick together. This is why cotton candy is almost always made fresh, and why you'll never see it wrapped in plastic like other confections. Honestly, when I think about how many variables have to align perfectly for cotton candy to work, it's amazing that two dentists in 1897 managed to stumble onto this process at all. The temperature, the spinning speed, the ambient humidity, the sugar quality, even the atmospheric pressure can affect the final result. The centrifugal force required to create cotton candy is substantial. Most machines spin at speeds between 3,000 and 4,000 revolutions per minute, creating forces dozens of times stronger than gravity. This is what pushes the liquid sugar through those tiny holes with enough velocity to form continuous threads rather than droplets, a principle that's also used in manufacturing synthetic fibers and certain types of glass wool. Modern food scientists have experimented with adding other ingredients to the basic sugar formula, creating cotton candy infused with vitamins, natural fruit flavors, and even protein supplements. These experiments have revealed interesting properties about how different molecules behave under the extreme conditions inside a cotton candy machine, though most additives tend to interfere with the delicate thread formation process. The color chemistry of cotton candy is surprisingly complex. Food coloring agents have to withstand the high temperatures of the melting process without breaking down or altering the sugar's behavior. Some dyes actually improve thread formation by slightly altering the surface tension of the liquid sugar, while others can cause the mixture to foam or create irregular textures. The size and shape of the spinning head also affects the final product in ways that weren't fully understood until relatively recently. Different hole configurations produce varying thread characteristics, with some creating denser, chewier textures while others create finer strands that dissolve more quickly but also break more easily during collection. The optimal design represents a compromise between production efficiency and eating quality. What makes cotton candy truly unique from a food science perspective is that it's one of the few confections where the manufacturing process is more important than the ingredients. The sugar is just ordinary sucrose, the same molecule you'd find in a sugar bowl, but the transformation it undergoes in that spinning machine creates something with completely different physical and sensory properties. The thermal dynamics involved are equally fascinating. The rapid cooling that solidifies the sugar threads releases latent heat, which is why cotton candy machines can actually warm the surrounding air, creating the distinctive microclimate around a cotton candy stand that experienced operators learn to work with rather than against. Scientific analysis has revealed that cotton candy's unique texture comes from its incredibly high surface area to volume ratio. The same amount of sugar that might form a small hard candy becomes a large, fluffy mass when spun into threads, dramatically increasing the contact area between the sugar and your taste buds, which enhances the perception of sweetness. Understanding the science doesn't diminish cotton candy's magic. If anything, it makes the achievement more impressive. Those early inventors didn't have access to precise temperature controls, sophisticated understanding of polymer science, or knowledge about crystalline structures. Yet they managed to create a process that food scientists still study today as an example of how simple principles can produce extraordinary results. The fact that something so scientifically complex can be produced by such seemingly simple equipment, and that the end result dissolves into sweetness at the touch of a tongue, represents a kind of edible alchemy that bridges the gap between chemistry and wonder, proving that sometimes the most magical experiences are also the most precisely engineered. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the sweet history of America's most whimsical confection. But really, this isn't an ending at all. Cotton candy's story continues every time a child sees those gossamer strands forming in a spinning machine for the first time. Every time someone catches the familiar aroma drifting across a fairground. Every time that distinctive pink cloud appears at a baseball game or amusement park, carrying with it more than a century of accumulated memories and wonder. What started with two Nashville dentists and their peculiar contraption has become something far more significant than anyone could have imagined in 1897. Cotton candy isn't just candy anymore. It's become a thread in the fabric of American culture, a sweet constant that connects generations, a reminder that some pleasures are worth preserving simply because they bring joy. Think about what cotton candy represents in the broader story of American innovation and entrepreneurship. Here was a product that succeeded not because it filled an essential need, but because it created its own category of desire. It proved that Americans were hungry for experiences that were purely, unapologetically, delightfully unnecessary, treats that existed for no reason other than to make life a little more magical. The evolution from fairy floss to cotton candy reflects something deeper about how America sees itself. The transition from a whimsical, European-sounding name to something distinctly American wasn't just marketing, it was cultural assertion. This country was declaring its right to transform even the most ethereal pleasures into something practical, accessible, and unmistakably its own. The carnival vendors who carried cotton candy across the continent during the early decades weren't just selling sugar. They were spreading a new kind of American dream. The idea that wonder could be democratized, that magic didn't have to be rare or expensive, that even the most ordinary small town deserved its share of sweetness and spectacle. The survival through the Depression and wartime rationing proved something important about cotton candy's place in the American psyche. Even when money was scarce and sugar was precious, people found ways to keep this particular tradition alive, understanding instinctively that some things are too valuable to lose, even if their value can't be measured in nutritional content or practical utility. The electric revolution of the 1950s democratized cotton candy production, but more importantly, it ensured that the knowledge and techniques wouldn't be lost. By making the process accessible to more operators, the industry protected itself against the kind of cultural amnesia that has claimed so many traditional crafts and foods. Cultural anthropologists remain divided on whether cotton candy's enduring appeal stems from genuine nostalgic connection or manufactured marketing sentiment, with some emphasizing authentic childhood memories and sensory experiences, while others argue that its cultural significance has been artificially constructed through decades of commercial promotion and strategic venue placement. The integration into permanent entertainment venues, from shopping malls to baseball stadiums, represents cotton candy's ultimate triumph. It proved that Americans didn't want magic to be confined to special occasions. They wanted it woven into the fabric of ordinary life, available whenever they needed a reminder that the world could still surprise and delight them. Today's cotton candy industry bears little resemblance to those early carnival operations, yet the essential experience remains unchanged. A child watching sugar transform into edible clouds experiences the same sense of wonder that captivated fairgoers in 1897. The machinery is more sophisticated, the flavors more varied, the venues more diverse, but the fundamental magic is identical. Honestly, there's something profoundly American about cotton candy's entire trajectory, from accidental invention to cultural institution. It embodies the nation's talent for taking simple ideas and scaling them into something that touches millions of lives, for finding ways to mass-produce wonder without destroying its essential character. The science we explored earlier, the complex chemistry and physics that make cotton candy possible, adds another layer to its significance. This isn't just a quaint traditional treat. It's a demonstration of applied science that happens to produce something beautiful and delicious, a bridge between the laboratory and the playground that makes both more accessible. Cotton candy's global spread, as American entertainment culture has influenced the world, has created interesting variations and adaptations. Different countries have developed their own flavoring preferences, presentation styles, and cultural associations, but the basic product remains recognizably the same invention that debuted in Nashville more than a century ago. The environmental considerations that affect modern cotton candy production, from packaging materials to energy efficiency, represent the latest chapter in its ongoing evolution. Contemporary operators are finding ways to maintain the traditional experience while reducing waste and improving sustainability, proving that even the most whimsical traditions can adapt to changing social consciousness. Perhaps most remarkably, cotton candy has maintained its essential character through more than a century of technological and cultural change. The experience of eating cotton candy today is fundamentally identical to what those first customers encountered at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. That kind of continuity is rare in American culture and precious in ways that extend far beyond mere nostalgia. The legacy of those two Nashville dentists, Morrison and Wharton, lives on not just in the billions of servings of cotton candy consumed each year, but in the proof they provided that the most unlikely people can create the most enduring innovations, that sometimes the most important inventions are the ones nobody actually needs, and that a little bit of sweetness, properly applied, can become a permanent part of the human experience. Cotton candy reminds us that not everything valuable has to be practical, that wonder is its own justification, and that sometimes the most profound innovations are the ones that simply make people smile. In a world that often seems determined to complicate even the simplest pleasures, cotton candy stands as a monument to the radical idea that some things should remain exactly as magical as they appear. And in that permanence, in that stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly what it seems, cotton candy offers us something we didn't know we needed. Proof that authenticity and mass production can coexist. That industrial efficiency doesn't have to kill magic, and that the best traditions are the ones that grow stronger rather than weaker as they spread. The sweet threads that began spinning in a Nashville workshop continue to connect us, generation to generation, memory to memory, moment to moment, creating an unbroken chain of shared wonder that proves some inventions become far more important than their inventors ever imagined, and that sometimes, The most lasting legacies are spun from nothing more substantial than sugar, air, and the persistent human desire for a little magic in our lives. And so, our sweet journey through the history of America's most whimsical confection draws to a gentle close. Like those delicate sugar strands that dissolve so softly on your tongue, this story too begins to fade, leaving behind only the sweetest memories and perhaps a new appreciation for the simple magic that surrounds us every day. You've traveled with us from that first spinning machine in Nashville, through carnival circuits and county fairs, past economic hardships and technological revolutions, all the way to the cotton candy stands that dot our modern landscape. Each thread of this tale, like the gossamer strands of spun sugar themselves, has woven together to create something larger, something that speaks to our enduring hunger for wonder, for sweetness, for those moments when the impossible becomes deliciously real. Think about it. Two dentists with a curious contraption accidentally created something that would bring joy to millions. Something that started as a luxury purchase became a democratic pleasure available to anyone willing to believe, if only for a moment, that sugar could be transformed into edible clouds. That persistence, that stubborn refusal to be anything other than magical, perhaps that's what makes cotton candy so perfectly, persistently American. The machines have evolved, the venues have changed, the names have shifted from fairy floss to cotton candy, but the essential experience remains unchanged. Children still watch in wonder as ordinary sugar becomes extraordinary. Adults still smile at that first taste, that instant dissolution, that sweet reminder of simpler times, simpler pleasures. And in that continuity, there's something deeply comforting, something that suggests that no matter how complex the world becomes, there will always be room for pure, uncomplicated joy, for treats that exist for no reason other than to make us happy. For moments when science and magic dance together in perfect harmony. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, let your thoughts drift like those cotton candy strands, light, airy, sweet. Allow yourself to dissolve into rest the way spun sugar dissolves on your tongue, effortlessly, naturally, completely. Perhaps, as you close your eyes, you can almost smell that distinctive aroma, that carnival sweetness that seems to carry with it all the joy of summer afternoons, warm evenings, and the kind of simple pleasures that make life worth savoring. Let your breathing slow, like the gradual spinning down of an old carnival machine at the end of a long day. Your thoughts becoming softer, lighter, more peaceful, like sugar crystals transforming into something altogether more gentle, more serene. The night air around you grows quiet, still, peaceful, just as those early fairgrounds would settle into silence after the last vendor packed away their wares, after the last light dimmed, after the last sweet cloud of cotton candy had dissolved into memory. And now, as you drift toward sleep, carry with you this simple truth, that sometimes the most profound magic comes from the simplest ingredients: sugar, air, heat, and a willingness to believe that wonderful things are possible, even in the most ordinary moments. Let your mind rest, like those delicate strands finding their perfect balance, suspended between earth and sky, between waking and sleeping, between the solid world of day and the gossamer realm of dreams. Sweet dreams, may they be as light, as magical, and as perfectly dissolving as cotton candy itself.